Welcome to my YouTube channel. Hit the like button, share your thoughts, subscribe and tap the bell icon. The night was still, quiet in a way that seemed almost unnatural. Officer Mark Jacobs sat in his recliner, the dim glow of the television flickering across his tired face. He had lived alone for years now, after the last of the 6 girls he had adopted had moved away. His house had been filled with the sounds of laughter, argument, and the occasional crash from some unholy teenage experiment. But those days were long gone. Now, it was just the low hum of the TV and the occasional sip of cold coffee. He thought back to those chaotic years, how he had taken in 6 girls, one by one, from a life of neglect, abuse, and despair. No one had believed in them. No one had given them a chance. But Mark had. He had given them a home, a family, and, most importantly, hope. But now, here he was, alone in the house that used to echo with their voices. He leaned back, rubbing his weary eyes. He had never imagined this would be his life, quiet, solitary, with only the hum of the city in the background. It had been years since they had last called, years since he had seen any of them. He kept track of their lives through social media posts, occasional texts, but the girls, now women, had drifted. They had their own lives to live, after all. Mark had come to terms with it, though a part of him always wondered what had happened to them. How had they turned out? He sighed, looking at the clock. 10:42 p.m. The house felt too empty tonight, the silence pressing down on him like a weight. And then it came. A knock at the door. At first, Mark thought it was a mistake. Maybe a neighbor, maybe a late-night delivery. He glanced at the peephole. His heart skipped a beat. 6 faces stared back at him, their expressions unreadable. They were no longer the scared, broken girls he had once taken in. These were strangers, grown women, but with eyes that held something different. Something cold. Mark's breath caught in his throat. His first instinct was to close the blinds and pretend he hadn't seen them. He didn't want to face this. Not now. Not after all these years. But as the knock came again, louder this time, his resolve crumbled. Slowly, he walked toward the door, his heart hammering in his chest. He opened it, trying to steady his voice. "What are you?" He stopped. His breath caught. Lisa, the eldest, stepped forward. Mark hadn't seen her in almost 15 years. She had been the first to leave, the first to find a life outside his home. She looked different. Hardened. Her face had lost the softness it once held. Her eyes, once filled with gratitude, now radiated something else, anger, maybe, or something darker. The others stood behind her, silent, watching him. It was like they had stepped out of his past, but their presence felt like a distant memory, unwelcome, almost. Lisa's lips parted, but it wasn't warmth he saw in her expression. "You don't deserve to know why we're here," she said, her voice flat. "But we've come to give you something." Mark's stomach churned. This wasn't a reunion. This wasn't a warm "thank you" for raising them, for saving them from their dark pasts. This was something else entirely. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his composure. "What's going on? What do you need?" Her eyes bored into him. There was a chill in the air now. The warmth of the house, the familiarity of it all, seemed to dissipate with every word that passed between them. Lisa held out a small envelope, aged and worn. It looked like it had been sitting somewhere for years, the edges frayed and tattered. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice laced with an icy finality. Mark reached out for the envelope, his hands trembling. What was this? What was going on? The last time he had seen these girls, now women, they had been lost in the world, struggling to build lives for themselves. Why would they show up now, after all these years? His fingers brushed against the envelope, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The room grew colder, the silence heavier. Lisa didn't move, just stared at him, her face unreadable. Mark pulled the envelope toward him, torn between fear and curiosity. What did it contain? What was this all about? The others remained silent, their faces expressionless. He couldn't even recognize them anymore. Marissa, the second eldest, stood behind Lisa, her arms crossed. Ella, the quiet one, hovered near the doorframe. The others, Rachel, Katie, and Samantha, had their backs to the wall, their eyes darting between him and Lisa. They were waiting for something, Mark realized, but he wasn't sure what. His voice came out shaky. Is this some kind of joke? Lisa's gaze hardened. This isn't a joke, Mark. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mark felt his throat tighten, the weight of their stares pressing down on him. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what they wanted, or why they had come back into his life after all this time. The last thing he remembered was them leaving, moving out, going on with their lives. And now, here they were. All of them. Back. But they weren't the same. Come inside, Mark said, his voice barely a whisper. Let's talk. He stepped aside, his heart pounding as the girls, no, the women, filed in one by one. They didn't speak as they passed him, not even a glance. Mark shut the door behind them, feeling the chill of the room settle into his bones. They gathered in the living room, standing by the couch but not sitting. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He had spent years raising them, loving them, trying to heal their broken lives. But now, they felt like strangers, like people who had come back to confront him, not with gratitude, but with something far more ominous. Mark sat across from them, his hands gripping the edge of the coffee table. What is this about? Why are you here? Lisa placed the envelope on the table, but she didn't open it. She just stared at him. The others stood still, their faces emotionless. You don't get to ask questions, Mark, she said, her voice low. We've come to give you a gift. One you're going to regret. A knot formed in Mark's stomach. What gift? He asked, his voice cracking. Lisa reached for the envelope, her fingers brushing the edges as she pulled it closer to herself. She looked at him for a long moment, almost as if weighing something. Then, without another word, she tore open the envelope. Inside was a letter, neatly folded, written in a crisp, deliberate hand. Lisa pulled it out and handed it to Mark. His hands shook as he took it, unable to tear his eyes away from the women who were watching him so intently. The letter was short. The handwriting was familiar, but the words were anything but comforting. You thought you saved us. But the truth is, we were never yours to save. And now, you will pay for what you did. The letter dropped from his hands like a burning coal. He could hardly breathe. What did it mean? Why had they come here with this? Mark looked up, his eyes wide. The silence that followed was unbearable. The women didn't move, didn't speak. They just watched him. And Mark realized, with a chilling certainty, that whatever had happened in the past, whatever he had done to try and help them, it had all been wrong. He had been wrong. The knock at the door wasn't just a reunion. It was a reckoning. Part 2, The Weight of the Past. Mark sat frozen, the letter still in his trembling hands. His mind was reeling, trying to comprehend what he had just read. You thought you saved us. But the truth is, we were never yours to save. And now, you will pay for what you did. The words burned into his brain, refusing to let go. The women in his living room stood in complete silence, their eyes locked on him, their faces unreadable. His own home felt alien now, colder than it had ever been before. The warmth of familiarity had disappeared, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, but the words stuck in his throat. What had he done? Why had they come back with such venom after all these years? Lisa's eyes didn't leave his. There was no hint of the grateful girl he had raised, no warmth, no affection. She was a stranger, someone who had crossed a line Mark couldn't even see. He had given everything to them, and yet, now it felt like all of that had been taken away. His sense of security, of having done the right thing, was slipping away faster than he could grasp it. Finally, Lisa spoke again, her voice low, almost too calm for the storm Mark felt brewing inside. You didn't save us, Mark. You took us from the fire only to throw us back in when you thought it was safe. Do you even know what you did to us? Mark opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His mind was spinning. He had saved them. He had rescued them from lives filled with neglect, violence, and hopelessness. He had given them the family they never had. He had loved them, cared for them. But somehow, in doing so, he had made an unforgivable mistake. Lisa's words hit him like a slap, but they weren't enough. Mark's mind raced back, to the days when he first met each of the 6 girls, to the chaos of his life before they came into it. The adoptions had been messy. He had taken them in from foster care, one by one, and tried to rebuild their lives. But had he made it worse? Was there something about his love for them, his attempts to save them, that had broken them instead? I don't understand, Mark finally said, his voice strained. He placed the letter back on the coffee table, not wanting to look at it anymore, but unable to tear his gaze away from the women standing before him. I did everything I could. I gave you a chance at life. I loved you. You loved us? Lisa scoffed, shaking her head. Is that what you think? You loved us? Mark's heart sank. Her voice was laced with bitterness, and the others behind her had not moved, not even to comfort her. They simply watched, waiting for something he didn't understand. You can't just take someone's life, Mark. You can't just insert yourself into their story and call it love. You don't know what we went through after you saved us, Lisa continued, her voice trembling with unspoken anger. Mark's mind scrambled to put the pieces together. He had always thought that, despite the hardships they'd faced, the girls had grown up better because of him. But now, the women in front of him were showing him a reality he hadn't been prepared for. Was it all a mistake? Was he truly the hero they had seen him as, or was he just a man who thought he knew best, imposing his version of a better life on them? I didn't mean to hurt any of you, Mark whispered, his voice breaking. He looked at Lisa, hoping to find some shred of the girl he had raised. But all he saw now was a stranger, a woman filled with pain and resentment. Lisa took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she spoke. We didn't ask for your help, Mark. We didn't ask for you to save us. You never bothered to ask us what we wanted, what we needed. You took us in because you wanted to feel like a hero. But you never asked how we felt. The words sliced through him. He had never thought of it that way. It was true, he had never asked. He had assumed that what he had done was the right thing. But what if it wasn't? What if, in trying to fix their broken lives, he had read them in ways he could never understand? Then what do you want from me? Mark asked, his voice raw. He stood up, pacing the room, unable to sit still. The walls of his home felt like they were closing in on him. What do you want me to do? Lisa's eyes glinted with something cold. We don't want your pity, Mark. We don't want your apologies. We're not the little girls you raised anymore. We've been on our own for years. And now we've come to make you understand the cost of your actions. Mark's head spun. What did she mean? What had he done that was so unforgivable? He turned to the others, trying to catch their eyes, but they avoided his gaze. His heart sank even further. These weren't the women who had once clung to him for safety. They had grown into something unrecognizable, something that felt far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. Marissa, the second eldest, spoke next, her voice cold and measured. You thought that by giving us a home, by taking us in, you could fix us. But you never fixed anything, Mark. You just gave us new problems. You couldn't see us as anything more than broken little girls, so you gave us a life that you thought would fix us. But in doing so, you robbed us of the ability to fix ourselves. You made us believe that we needed you. Her words landed like a punch to the gut. Mark felt his breath catch in his throat. He had never seen it that way. He had thought he was doing the right thing, that by giving them a home, he was giving them a chance at a better future. But maybe he had taken away their agency. Maybe, in trying to fix them, he had crushed their ability to live on their own terms. We didn't need you to save us, Ella added, her voice quiet but filled with pain. We needed you to trust us. To let us find our own way. But you never gave us that choice. Mark's chest tightened. Each word felt like a blow. He had never considered that their lives, his girls' lives, had been about more than just saving them. He had assumed they needed him. But now, it was clear they had been suffocated by his attempts to fix their lives. The silence in the room grew heavy. Mark couldn't speak. What could he say? How could he explain that he had tried to give them everything, but in doing so, he might have taken away their right to choose for themselves? Finally, Lisa broke the silence again. We're not here for you to apologize, Mark. We're here because we've spent years dealing with the fallout of what you did to us. And now we need you to pay for it. Mark's eyes widened. Pay for it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What do you mean? Lisa's gaze was cold, calculating. We're not the little girls you once knew. And we've learned that the only way to get what we deserve is to take it. We've come to settle the score. Mark felt a chill run through him. What had he done? What had happened to these women he had loved and tried so hard to protect? And what did settle the score mean? The room felt colder now, the tension palpable. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as the full weight of the situation began to settle in. He had tried to save them. But now, it seemed like he was the one who needed saving. And it was only just beginning. Mark stared at the women in his living room, his heart heavy with confusion and fear. The coldness in their eyes was unmistakable. There was no recognition of the man who had once been their protector, their father figure. There was only anger. Anger that he had never seen coming, never expected. And it hit him harder than anything else ever had. Settle the score, Lisa had said. The words echoed in Mark's mind, louder than the silence that filled the room now. What had he done? What had gone wrong? His eyes darted to the envelope still sitting on the coffee table. He had barely had the courage to look at it again since reading the chilling message. It felt like a warning, a promise that something far darker was about to unfold. But what was it? What had he missed all these years? He wanted to ask more questions. He needed answers. But he could sense that pushing further would only make it worse. These women, these girls he had tried to save, were not here to reconcile, to heal the past. They were here to demand something. Something he wasn't prepared to give. Lisa finally broke the silence, her voice almost serene despite the storm of emotions raging in the room. You never understood us, Mark. You thought you could just sweep us up, put us in a new life, and everything would be fine. But you were wrong. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but a deeper part of him knew that what she was saying held some truth. Had he been so blinded by his own need to feel like a savior that he never really considered what these girls, now women, truly needed? What if, in trying to fix their broken lives, he had only made things worse? We don't want your sympathy, Lisa continued. We don't need you to apologize. What we need, Mark, is something more than what you gave us. And you can't give it to us. Mark's mind was spinning, his thoughts colliding with each other in an unrelenting rush. "What do you want from me, Lisa?" he asked, his voice strained. He could barely bring himself to look at her. She wasn't the girl he had raised, the one who had smiled at him and thanked him for giving her a chance. This woman standing in front of him was a stranger, a woman filled with anger and a sense of betrayal that Mark couldn't even begin to understand. "We want you to understand, finally, that you can't save everyone, Mark," Lisa said, her voice cold. "You can't fix everything. And you certainly can't fix us." Ella, who had been standing near the back of the room, stepped forward, her eyes now fixed on Mark. "You think you know what we went through. You think you know what we needed. But you were never there for the things that mattered. The things that shaped us." Her voice cracked as she continued, but she didn't look away. "You couldn't see the damage your help did. You never saw the scars we carried from before you came into our lives." Mark's chest tightened at her words. He had tried. He had tried so hard to fix their lives, to give them everything they could ever want or need. But Ella was right. He hadn't seen everything. He had never asked the questions that mattered. He had assumed that what he had done was enough. That loving them and giving them a better life would heal the wounds they carried. But now, he saw that it was never that simple. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know what else to do. I thought I was giving you a chance at a better life." Lisa's lips curled into a bitter smile. "A better life? Is that what you think this is? What you gave us?" She shook her head, her eyes flashing with anger. "You gave us a life where we were forced to be someone else, to live the way you thought was best. You didn't see us for who we were. You saw us as broken things to be fixed. But we were never broken, Mark. Not like you thought." Mark felt a knot in his stomach tighten. The weight of her words pressed down on him, suffocating him. He had always believed he was doing the right thing. He had always thought that his intentions were pure, that his love for them was enough. But now, as Lisa's words echoed in his mind, he wondered how many times he had made decisions for them without considering what they truly wanted. What if he had never really known them at all? "Do you know what it felt like," Lisa continued, her voice low and harsh, "to be told that your life could only be saved if you lived according to someone else's plan? That you could only be okay if you lived the way someone else thought was best for you?" Mark's throat tightened, guilt rising within him like a tidal wave. He had never seen it like this before. He had never understood how his decisions might have affected them. How his need to be the hero in their lives had become a burden, a cage that had prevented them from finding their own way. "We didn't need to be fixed," Lisa said. "We needed to be heard. To be seen. To be understood. But you never did that. You just gave us your version of salvation." Ella added quietly, "And now, we've spent years dealing with the consequences of that. Trying to figure out who we are, who we were before you came into our lives. And it hasn't been easy." Mark felt his heart twist in his chest. The words hit harder than he ever expected. He had thought that taking them in had been the right thing, the noble thing. But now, he saw that in trying to save them, he had inadvertently taken away their power, their sense of control over their own lives. Rachel, who had been standing quietly off to the side, now stepped forward. "You think this is about you, Mark," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet intensity. "But it's not. It's about us. It's about what you did to us." Mark's eyes searched her face. Rachel had always been the quiet one, the one who kept to herself. But now, standing before him, she was no longer the shy, withdrawn girl he had raised. She was a woman, full of pain, full of unspoken words. And Mark knew that whatever had happened in the past, whatever mistakes he had made, they had scarred her deeply. "You took us in, yes," Rachel continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "but you never took the time to see us. To really see us. And now, we have to live with that. We have to live with the damage that came from being raised by someone who thought they knew better. Someone who couldn't see beyond their own idea of what was right. Mark's mind was spinning. The weight of their words was crushing him. What had he done? He had tried so hard to make a difference, to give them the life he thought they deserved. But in doing so, had he ruined them? Samantha, the youngest, spoke for the first time. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife. You think this is just about you feeling guilty, don't you? But it's not. We're here because we have to make you understand. We have to make you realize what you did to us. Mark's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean, make me understand? He asked, his voice shaking. What do you want me to do? Lisa's cold gaze met his. We're not here to get an apology, Mark. We're here because you need to feel the weight of what you've done. You need to understand the damage, the pain. And you need to see the consequences of the choices you made. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark's mind raced, the walls of his home closing in on him. He had never imagined that his attempt to save these girls, to give them a better life, could have led to this. He had thought he was doing good, but now he realized that he had never truly understood what they had needed. They hadn't needed saving. They had needed a chance to heal. A chance to choose their own path. And now, it was too late. Mark sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the faces of the women he had raised. The words they had spoken over the past hours had slowly begun to sink in, each one a blow to his chest. But even as the weight of their anger and resentment pressed down on him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something far worse was coming. He could sense the storm that had been building, the tension that had been hanging in the air since they walked through the door. It had started as a conversation. Now, it felt more like a reckoning. Lisa, still standing in front of him, finally broke the heavy silence that had enveloped the room. Her voice was low but filled with a cold determination that sent chills through Mark. You thought we would just walk away, didn't you? She asked, her gaze sharp and piercing. You thought you could sit here, say a few words of apology, and everything would go back to the way it was. That we'd all go back to being the grateful girls you saved. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He had hoped for some kind of resolution, some way to make things right. But deep down, he knew that it wasn't going to be that easy. It was never going to be that easy. You never understood, Lisa continued, her voice unwavering. You thought you could fix everything with your good intentions. But fixing people isn't about giving them what you think they need. It's about giving them the space to decide for themselves. You never gave us that. Mark's mind was reeling, and the room felt smaller with every word that passed through Lisa's lips. He could feel the eyes of the other women on him, their silent judgment weighing heavily in the room. Their anger, though still simmering, was palpable. It was as though they were all united in one thing, the belief that Mark had failed them. And no amount of explanation, no apology, would ever be enough to erase what he had done. But you didn't just fail us, did you? Rachel's voice cut through the tension. Mark hadn't realized she had stepped forward until now. Her face was calm, but there was an intensity in her eyes that made Mark flinch. You failed yourself too. All these years, you've carried the belief that you did something good. That you saved us. But the truth is, Mark, you never saw the full picture. Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry as he tried to process what she was saying. He had done what he thought was right. He had opened his home, his heart, to these girls who had no one. He had given them everything he could. But in the process, had he ignored the very people he thought he was helping? What are you trying to say, Rachel? Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. He had no idea what they were leading up to, but he could feel the ground beneath him shifting. Whatever he had thought this conversation was about, it was quickly turning into something else entirely. Samantha, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke. "You didn't just raise us, Mark. You raised your idea of us. You saw us as victims, as broken people who needed to be fixed. And you treated us like we were incapable of doing anything on our own." She took a step forward, her eyes hardening. "And when we tried to stand on our own 2 feet, you pulled us back, told us we weren't ready, told us we needed you." Mark recoiled at her words, as if they had struck him physically. Had he really done that? Had he really never allowed them to find their own path? Had he been so blinded by his own need to be the hero, the savior, that he had suffocated their voices in the process? "You never trusted us," Samantha continued, her voice growing stronger. "You never gave us the chance to choose for ourselves. You told us how to live, how to think, what was right and wrong. And when we didn't fit into the mold you made for us, you made us feel like we were the ones who were broken." Mark's chest tightened as a deep, gnawing feeling of regret settled over him. The truth of their words cut through him like a knife. He had never seen it that way before. He had always believed that by loving them, by raising them the way he thought was best, he was giving them a better life. But in doing so, he had taken away their agency. Their freedom. And now, it was too late to undo the damage. "Maybe it's not just about what you did to us, Mark," Lisa said, her tone softer but still laced with bitterness. "Maybe it's about what you didn't do." Mark's heart raced. He could feel his entire world crumbling around him, piece by piece. Everything he had done, everything he had believed in, was under scrutiny. And now, it felt as though all the years he had spent raising these girls, trying to give them a better life, were slipping through his fingers. "What do you mean?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lisa's gaze hardened, and for the first time since she walked through his door, her expression softened, as though a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. "You never gave us the opportunity to be the people we were meant to be. You never gave us the space to discover who we were outside of your rescue. And now, we're trying to find that. We're trying to find ourselves." The silence that followed her words was deafening. Mark stood there, his mind reeling, trying to process everything that had just been said. He had spent years thinking he was doing the right thing. But now, all he could see were the cracks in his actions, the moments when his well-meaning efforts had turned into suffocating control. "Do you see now, Mark?" Lisa's voice broke through the silence again, and this time, there was no anger in it. Instead, there was something darker. "This isn't just about you. This is about us. We've spent the last 2 decades trying to undo what you did to us. And you were too blind to see it." Mark's breath hitched, his chest tight with a mixture of guilt and helplessness. It felt as though the very foundation of his life was collapsing, the walls that had once been so steady now crumbling under the weight of their words. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. He wasn't sure who he was apologizing to anymore, whether it was to them, to himself, or to the version of him that had believed he could fix everything. The room was silent, the weight of the past hanging thick in the air. Mark could feel his heart beating in his chest, every thump a reminder of how much he had failed them. But even as the guilt threatened to swallow him whole, he knew one thing for certain: it wasn't over. There was more to come. More revelations. More truths. And the worst part? He had no idea what was coming next. The room was heavy with the weight of unsaid words. Mark sat, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to steady his thoughts. His world had turned upside down in the last few hours. It felt as though every foundation he had ever built, every belief he had held about himself and his actions, was now crumbling. He had always considered himself a savior, someone who took broken lives and made them whole. But the truth that was now unraveling before him felt like a punch to the gut. The women, his daughters, as he had always called them, had made it clear that the life he had given them wasn't salvation. It wasn't a life built on love or healing. It was a life of control, of misguided intentions. And that truth, as painful as it was, had become his reality. He couldn't deny it anymore. But there was something else, something far more sinister that Mark hadn't yet understood. A feeling that had begun to gnaw at him ever since they first entered the room. The tension in the air wasn't just about their anger. It wasn't just about his failures. There was a deeper, darker undertone that Mark couldn't quite grasp, but he could feel it. It was there, lurking beneath the surface, pulling the strings in ways he hadn't even realized. Lisa, still standing in front of him, seemed to read his thoughts. Her eyes softened, just a fraction, before they hardened once more. "You really don't get it, do you, Mark?" she said, her voice low, almost pitying. "You think this is just about what you did to us. But it's not. There's more." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" His voice came out almost desperate, a quiet pleading beneath the surface. The other women, Rachel, Samantha, Ella, and the others, exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of resignation and something darker. Mark could feel the atmosphere shift, like a storm about to break. Rachel spoke this time, her words cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. "You know, Mark, it's funny. You've spent all this time thinking you were the one in control. Thinking you were the one who decided how our lives would go. But you never stopped to ask us what we wanted. You never bothered to ask how we really felt about any of this." Mark swallowed, guilt tightening in his chest. He had spent years trying to create a life that he thought would save them. But had he ever truly considered their needs, their desires, their own voices in all of this? The answer came crashing down on him. "Do you think we wanted to be saved?" Rachel continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "Do you think we asked you to come into our lives and take over? To tell us what to do, how to live? We didn't need fixing. We just needed someone to listen." Ella, who had been silent for much of the conversation, now spoke. Her voice was filled with quiet fury. "And you couldn't even do that. All you did was impose your version of salvation on us, and we were supposed to accept it, to be grateful for it. But we weren't grateful, Mark. We were suffocating." Mark's breath caught in his throat. The realization hit him like a wave. He had been so consumed with the idea of saving them, of being the hero, that he had never once thought about their agency. Their autonomy. He had taken control of their lives without ever considering that they might want something different. "And it's not just that," Lisa said, her voice taking on a darker edge. "It's that you never let us speak. You never let us have a voice in any of this. You thought we were too broken to know what we needed. But the truth is, we knew exactly what we needed. We needed freedom. The freedom to choose our own paths." Mark's chest tightened as his mind whirled. He wanted to argue, to explain himself, but the words caught in his throat. How could he have been so blind? How could he have missed this? He had always believed he was giving them the world, that he was doing the right thing. But in reality, he had been taking away their chance to truly live. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. The sound echoed through the room, breaking the intense silence that had enveloped them. Mark looked up, startled, unsure whether the intrusion was a sign of relief or just another complication. Before he could stand up, the door creaked open, and a man entered the room. His tall figure filled the doorway, and his presence was enough to make everyone freeze. Mark didn't recognize him immediately. The man's face was unfamiliar, but there was something about him, a sharpness in his eyes, an intensity in the way he moved, that immediately made Mark uneasy. "Who are you?" Mark asked, his voice cautious. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at the women in the room, then back at Mark. His expression was unreadable. "I think you know why I'm here," he finally said, his voice low and steady. The women in the room tensed, their bodies stiffening as if in anticipation. Mark felt a cold shiver run down his spine. There was something off about this man, something that didn't sit right. "Mark," Lisa said, her voice cold, "this is someone from our past. Someone we've been trying to avoid for a long time." The man's eyes flicked to Lisa, then to the other women. His lips curled into a slight, almost imperceptible smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Avoiding me," he said, his voice laced with a hint of amusement. "I think it's more like you've been hiding from me. All of you." Mark felt a wave of unease wash over him. The room was growing colder by the second. The man's presence, coupled with the women's reactions, told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't just about past mistakes. This was something much bigger. Something that had been brewing in the shadows for years. "What do you want?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man looked at him with a steady gaze, his eyes unblinking. "I'm here to make sure the truth comes out. To make sure everything you've tried to bury comes to light." Mark's pulse quickened. The air seemed to thicken, heavy with the weight of his words. There was something sinister in his tone, something that made Mark's skin crawl. "Truth?" Mark repeated, his voice trembling slightly. "What truth?" The man took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Mark's. "The truth about what really happened. The truth about the lies you've been living. The truth about the consequences of your actions." For the first time since the women had arrived, Mark felt a sense of genuine fear settle in his chest. This man was not here by accident. His arrival was no coincidence. And whatever he was about to reveal, it would shake the very foundations of everything Mark thought he knew. As the man took another step forward, the women stood in a silent, united front, their faces betraying nothing but cold determination. Lisa's eyes locked with Mark's, and in that fleeting moment, he saw something in her gaze that made his stomach drop. This was bigger than he had imagined. The truth that was about to come to light would unravel everything. And Mark wasn't sure if he was ready to face it. The room was heavy with the weight of unsaid words. Mark sat, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to steady his thoughts. His world had turned upside down in the last few hours. It felt as though every foundation he had ever built, every belief he had held about himself and his actions, was now crumbling. He had always considered himself a savior, someone who took broken lives and made them whole. But the truth that was now unraveling before him felt like a punch to the gut. The women, his daughters, as he had always called them, had made it clear that the life he had given them wasn't salvation. It wasn't a life built on love or healing. It was a life of control, of misguided intentions. And that truth, as painful as it was, had become his reality. He couldn't deny it anymore. But there was something else, something far more sinister that Mark hadn't yet understood. A feeling that had begun to gnaw at him ever since they first entered the room. The tension in the air wasn't just about their anger. It wasn't just about his failures. There was a deeper, darker undertone that Mark couldn't quite grasp, but he could feel it. It was there, lurking beneath the surface, pulling the strings in ways he hadn't even realized. Lisa, still standing in front of him, seemed to read his thoughts. Her eyes softened, just a fraction, before they hardened once more. "You really don't get it, do you, Mark?" she said, her voice low, almost pitying. "You think this is just about what you did to us. But it's not. There's more." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" His voice came out almost desperate, a quiet pleading beneath the surface. The other women, Rachel, Samantha, Ella, and the others, exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of resignation and something darker. Mark could feel the atmosphere shift, like a storm about to break. Rachel spoke this time, her words cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. "You know, Mark, it's funny. You've spent all this time thinking you were the one in control. Thinking you were the one who decided how our lives would go. But you never stopped to ask us what we wanted. You never bothered to ask how we really felt about any of this. Mark swallowed, guilt tightening in his chest. He had spent years trying to create a life that he thought would save them. But had he ever truly considered their needs, their desires, their own voices in all of this? The answer came crashing down on him. Do you think we wanted to be saved? Rachel continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. Do you think we asked you to come into our lives and take over? To tell us what to do, how to live? We didn't need fixing. We just needed someone to listen. Ella, who had been silent for much of the conversation, now spoke. Her voice was filled with quiet fury. And you couldn't even do that. All you did was impose your version of salvation on us, and we were supposed to accept it, to be grateful for it. But we weren't grateful, Mark. We were suffocating. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The realization hit him like a wave. He had been so consumed with the idea of saving them, of being the hero, that he had never once thought about their agency. Their autonomy. He had taken control of their lives without ever considering that they might want something different. And it's not just that, Lisa said, her voice taking on a darker edge. It's that you never let us speak. You never let us have a voice in any of this. You thought we were too broken to know what we needed. But the truth is, we knew exactly what we needed. We needed freedom. The freedom to choose our own paths. Mark's chest tightened as his mind whirled. He wanted to argue, to explain himself, but the words caught in his throat. How could he have been so blind? How could he have missed this? He had always believed he was giving them the world, that he was doing the right thing. But in reality, he had been taking away their chance to truly live. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. The sound echoed through the room, breaking the intense silence that had enveloped them. Mark looked up, startled, unsure whether the intrusion was a sign of relief or just another complication. Before he could stand up, the door creaked open, and a man entered the room. His tall figure filled the doorway, and his presence was enough to make everyone freeze. Mark didn't recognize him immediately. The man's face was unfamiliar, but there was something about him, a sharpness in his eyes, an intensity in the way he moved, that immediately made Mark uneasy. Who are you? Mark asked, his voice cautious. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at the women in the room, then back at Mark. His expression was unreadable. I think you know why I'm here, he finally said, his voice low and steady. The women in the room tensed, their bodies stiffening as if in anticipation. Mark felt a cold shiver run down his spine. There was something off about this man, something that didn't sit right. Mark, Lisa said, her voice cold, this is someone from our past. Someone we've been trying to avoid for a long time. The man's eyes flicked to Lisa, then to the other women. His lips curled into a slight, almost imperceptible smile, but there was no warmth in it. Avoiding me, he said, his voice laced with a hint of amusement. I think it's more like you've been hiding from me. All of you. Mark felt a wave of unease wash over him. The room was growing colder by the second. The man's presence, coupled with the women's reactions, told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't just about past mistakes. This was something much bigger. Something that had been brewing in the shadows for years. What do you want? Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man looked at him with a steady gaze, his eyes unblinking. I'm here to make sure the truth comes out. To make sure everything you've tried to bury comes to light. Mark's pulse quickened. The air seemed to thicken, heavy with the weight of his words. There was something sinister in his tone, something that made Mark's skin crawl. Truth? Mark repeated, his voice trembling slightly. What truth? The man took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Mark's. The truth about what really happened. The truth about the lies you've been living. The truth about the consequences of your actions. For the first time since the women had arrived, Mark felt a sense of genuine fear settle in his chest. This man was not here by accident. His arrival was no coincidence. And whatever he was about to reveal, it would shake the very foundations of everything Mark thought he knew. As the man took another step forward, the women stood in a silent, united front, their faces betraying nothing but cold determination. Lisa's eyes locked with Mark's, and in that fleeting moment, he saw something in her gaze that made his stomach drop. This was bigger than he had imagined. The truth that was about to come to light would unravel everything. And Mark wasn't sure if he was ready to face it. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, each beat growing louder in his ears. The man in front of him wasn't just a stranger, he was a symbol of something Mark had hoped would stay buried. He couldn't look away, his eyes locked on the man's unblinking gaze. Something about him made Mark feel as though every mistake he'd ever made was about to be exposed. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. The room had grown unnervingly silent after the man's words. The women stood still, their faces unreadable, as if they had been waiting for this moment their entire lives. Mark felt small, trapped in a room that once felt like a safe haven, but now felt like a cage. "You all know him," the man said, breaking the silence, his voice smooth but with an edge of warning. "But none of you have told Mark the full story." "Not even you," he said, nodding toward Lisa. Mark turned his gaze to Lisa, his throat dry. "What's he talking about?" His voice barely rose above a whisper, the questions swirling in his mind. Lisa, who had been so determined earlier, now seemed to waver. Her lips trembled, but she quickly masked it, pushing the emotion deep inside. It was like a wall going up between her and Mark, one that he couldn't climb. "It's not what you think," she finally said, her voice soft but full of hesitation. The man smiled, a wicked grin that made Mark's blood run cold. "Oh, but it is, Lisa. It is exactly what he thinks." Lisa's expression faltered as she tried to stand her ground. "You can't just walk in here, after all these years, Anne." "And what?" the man interrupted. "Tell the truth? Finally give this man what he deserves? Let him know what he's been too blind to see." The tension in the room felt suffocating, and Mark could feel it closing in on him. He had spent so long thinking of himself as a protector, a hero, but now the walls were closing in, and his past was about to crash down on him. The man turned to Mark, his eyes no longer a neutral shade, but dark with something deeper. "You think you saved them, don't you? That you gave them a life they couldn't have on their own?" He shook his head. "You were a fool." Mark tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. I thought I was doing what was right. I gave them a home. I gave them a chance." The man's laugh was sharp, bitter, and it echoed in Mark's ears. "A chance? No. You gave them your version of a chance. You gave them the life you wanted them to have, not the one they needed." Mark's mind was spinning now. He had heard these words from the women, yes, but hearing them from this stranger, someone clearly entwined in the past he had thought forgotten, it was different. The weight of what he had done began to sink in like a slow, painful tide. "What are you talking about?" Mark's voice cracked under the pressure. "Who are you, and what do you know about any of this?" The man stepped forward, closing the gap between them with the kind of slow, deliberate steps that made Mark feel like prey. "I know exactly what happened all those years ago. I was there, Mark. I was there when the girls really needed help. And I was the one who got ignored." Mark took a step back, his mind racing. "You're lying." I don't understand. Who are you?" The man's smile faded, and he looked at Mark with an almost pitiful expression. "I'm someone you refused to acknowledge. Someone you thought you could control, just like you did with these girls. But you can't control everything, can you, Mark? That's what you never understood." Lisa's face paled, and she took a step back, her eyes flicking nervously toward the door. "Don't," she whispered, though Mark wasn't sure if she was warning the man or herself. The man continued, his voice growing darker. "You see, when you first brought them into your home, you didn't just rescue them from their past. You sealed them into a future where they were bound by your rules, your expectations. They had no choice but to obey, no chance to make their own decisions. That was your gift, wasn't it? But I'll tell you something you don't know. You didn't save them, Mark. You destroyed them in ways you'll never fully understand." The words hit Mark like a slap to the face. His chest tightened, and his legs nearly gave out from under him. "That's not true. I gave them everything I could. I loved them, I gave them everything I didn't have as a child. You gave them nothing," the man spat, his voice sharp. "You took from them their dignity, their autonomy. And now look at them. They've spent their lives running from your shadow, trying to rebuild themselves after you tried to make them into something they weren't." The words cut through Mark's defenses like a knife. He wanted to deny them, to argue, to make it all go away, but he couldn't. Deep down, he knew. He knew that he hadn't been the savior he thought he was. He had been a man trying to impose his own version of salvation on people who didn't need saving. He had trapped them in a cage of his own making, and now they were paying the price. The man's gaze never left Mark. "I was there when Lisa and the others tried to leave you, tried to make a life on their own. And you wouldn't let them. You couldn't let them go. You thought they owed you something for giving them a better life, but in the process, you took away their right to choose. You thought love would fix everything, but all it did was suffocate them." Mark's legs buckled, and he collapsed into the nearest chair. His head spun, his thoughts jumbled. This man, this stranger, had been in the shadows all along, watching as Mark thought he was helping, when in reality, he had been keeping them trapped in his idealized world. "Who are you?" Mark finally asked again, his voice barely more than a whisper. The man's eyes gleamed with a cold amusement. "I'm the man you tried to ignore. The one who saw through all of your lies. I'm the one who knew what you were doing all along." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And now, Mark, you're going to find out what happens when you take control of someone else's life, when you think you know better than they do. The past has a way of catching up with you. And it's time you faced the consequences of what you've done." Lisa, looking pale and defeated, finally spoke up, her voice barely audible. "This is why we didn't want you to know, Mark. You're not ready for what's coming. You never were." Mark's world shattered. The truth had come crashing in, unrelenting and unforgiving. The foundation of everything he thought he knew had crumbled, and now he was left to face the wreckage. He had built his life on lies, on the lie that he could control fate, that he could save others. And now, everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in, was slipping away. The man turned to leave, his words echoing in Mark's ears. "I'll be waiting, Mark. You can't outrun the truth. You'll have to face it sooner or later." And with that, he was gone. Mark sat there, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts, emotions, and guilt. His entire life, everything he had done for the past 20 years, was now meaningless. It was as though he had been living in a dream, believing he was the hero, when all along, he had been the villain. The silence in the room was deafening. Lisa, Rachel, Samantha, and the others stood motionless, their expressions unreadable. Mark looked up, but he couldn't find the words to speak. What was there to say now? Everything was falling apart, and there was no way to put the pieces back together. The silence that followed the man's departure was suffocating. It was as if the room had become a vacuum, all the air sucked out, leaving nothing but a heavy, oppressive stillness. Mark sat motionless, his hands resting on his knees, the weight of everything that had been said crashing down on him. His mind was a blur, the words the man had spoken spinning around in his head like a twisted carousel. You destroyed them. You took away their dignity, their autonomy. Over and over, those words echoed in his ears. For years, Mark had been proud of what he had done. He had rescued 6 girls from broken homes, given them a roof over their heads, a chance to escape the horrors they had been born into. He had thought he was a hero. But now it felt like he had been nothing more than a warden in a gilded cage. Lisa stood in the corner, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, her expression unreadable. Rachel, Samantha, and Ella stood together in a huddled group, speaking in hushed tones. There was no warmth in their words anymore, no trace of the bonds that had once existed between them. Mark felt the space between them growing wider with each passing second. They weren't the little girls he had once saved, they were adults now, shaped by their own experiences, their own struggles. And those struggles hadn't been the ones he had imagined. They hadn't been the ones he had tried to save them from. Mark forced himself to stand. His legs felt weak beneath him, but he had to do something. Anything. He couldn't just sit here, frozen by the truth. His voice cracked, and he cleared his throat, trying again. I never meant to hurt you. I never wanted to control you. Lisa's eyes met his, her gaze cold. You didn't mean to, Mark. But you did it anyway. You didn't see us. You never saw us for who we really were. You only saw what you wanted us to be. Her words were a slap to the face. They were the truth, the brutal, raw truth that he had tried so hard to avoid. He had built a life for them, but it was a life shaped by his own ideals, not theirs. He had never once asked them what they wanted, what they needed. And now, they were standing here, unrecognizable, as the women they had become. Strong, independent, but still, in their own way, broken by the very man who had claimed to save them. Mark's chest tightened. I was just trying to give you a better life. I thought that was what you needed, what you wanted. And that's the problem, Rachel said, her voice hard, but her eyes still filled with hurt. You never asked us. You never bothered to listen. You thought you knew what was best for us, but you didn't. You couldn't. The words cut deeper than anything physical. He had spent years telling himself that what he had done was the right thing. That by taking control of their lives, he had given them a chance. But in reality, all he had done was rob them of their choice, of their agency, of their ability to shape their own futures. And now, he was paying the price for his arrogance. The room grew quieter still as the women began to speak in low voices, not to him, but to each other. Mark could feel the space between them widening further. It was as if he had no place in their world anymore. They had moved on, and he hadn't even realized it until now. Samantha, who had remained quiet for most of the conversation, now looked up at Mark. Her face was soft, but there was a sadness in her eyes that Mark had never seen before. You never understood, did you? That we were never your daughters, Mark. We weren't your charity case, your project. We were real people. We had our own dreams, our own struggles. But you couldn't see that. You never let us be ourselves. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had tried to shape them into what he wanted, what he thought they should be, and in the process, he had stolen their identities, their sense of self. I'm sorry, he whispered, but the words felt hollow. He had said them so many times before, and yet they never seemed to hold any weight. How could they now? How could he apologize for something so much bigger than himself? Ella stepped forward, her eyes full of fire. Sorry doesn't fix anything. Sorry doesn't undo the years we lost, the years you took from us. Sorry doesn't erase the damage you caused. It doesn't give us back what we could have been. Her words stung like needles, but Mark didn't argue. He couldn't. She was right. No apology, no amount of regret, would ever be enough to undo what had been done. He had tried to save them, but in the process, he had only trapped them. Lisa took a step forward now, her voice steady but filled with a quiet, restrained anger. You think you gave us a better life, Mark. But all you gave us was a life that was dictated by your rules, your beliefs. And you know what? We didn't ask for that. We didn't need saving. We needed freedom. Mark's throat tightened. He had always thought that freedom meant giving them a home, giving them security, giving them everything they needed to thrive. But now, he understood. True freedom was something else entirely. It was the ability to make choices for oneself, to live without fear of being controlled or manipulated. I thought I was doing the right thing, Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know. I didn't know how badly I was hurting you. Of course you didn't, Rachel replied bitterly. Because you never bothered to listen. You never bothered to hear us. The words stung, but Mark didn't pull away. He deserved them. They had all suffered because of his blindness, and he knew it. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He didn't want to face anyone else right now. But when the door opened, it wasn't another stranger or some authority figure coming to confront him. It was a face Mark recognized, although he hadn't seen it in years. The man who had visited earlier, the one who had spoken the truth Mark had tried to avoid, stood in the doorway once more. He hadn't left. He hadn't been here just to reveal the past. He had come back for something else. I told you, the man said, his voice calm, almost too calm. The truth has a way of catching up with you. And now that it has, there's no turning back. Mark didn't have the strength to ask questions. All he could do was sit there, defeated, as the past he had long buried came rushing back to the surface. The reckoning had come. And there was no escaping it. The room felt colder now, the weight of the past pressing down on everyone. Mark had been waiting for this moment, or perhaps dreading it, he wasn't sure which. After all that had happened, he knew this was the final reckoning, the last chapter of a story that had been unfolding in ways he never could have imagined. The man who had come back, the one who had spent so long in the shadows, was still standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He hadn't left when Mark thought he would. In fact, he seemed to be waiting for something that Mark still couldn't grasp. The women stood in silence, each of them looking at the man, then at Mark, their expressions a mixture of anger, pain, and something else, something that hinted at a deeper understanding, something Mark couldn't quite place. Mark felt the weight of their gazes on him, the judgment, the disappointment, and something more, something colder. The final piece of the puzzle that had been missing for all these years was now about to be revealed, and it was all his doing. I should have seen this coming, Mark muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He had been so sure, so convinced, that he was doing the right thing all those years ago. He had told himself that he was rescuing them, giving them something better. But in the end, he had been no more than a man blinded by his own sense of control. And now, here he was, standing at the edge of a cliff, with nowhere to go but down. The man finally spoke, his voice low but forceful. It's time, Mark. You need to understand that you can't fix the past. You've done what you've done, and now you'll have to live with it. But what happens now, that's still in your hands. Mark's head snapped up, his heart racing. What do you mean? What happens now? I've lost everything. There's nothing left. The man's lips curled into a small, almost pitying smile. You're wrong. There's still something left, your redemption. Your choice. You can keep running from this, or you can face it. But understand this, the women here have already decided. Their choices were taken from them, but now, they're free. Mark looked at the women. They were no longer the broken girls he had brought into his home. They had grown into women who had learned, suffered, and fought for their place in the world. They had lived in his shadow for too long, but now, they had risen above it. Lisa stepped forward first. Her voice was steady, no longer filled with the tremors of fear or uncertainty that had once marked her every word. We've spent our whole lives trying to escape your grip, Mark. But we've done more than survive. We've rebuilt ourselves. We don't need you to save us anymore. Mark felt a wave of guilt and shame wash over him. The harsh truth of her words stung more than any of the accusations they had made before. He had never truly seen them, never understood their pain, their fight for independence. They had been fighting him, too, in their own way, trying to break free from the chains he had unknowingly wrapped around them. Rachel's voice broke the silence that followed. We can't just go back to the way things were, Mark. You've made sure of that. But now, it's time for all of us to move forward. We can't live in the past anymore. Mark swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He had no words left. They were right. He couldn't undo the damage he had done. And yet, there was a part of him that wanted to fix it, to make amends somehow. But how? How could he ever make things right when everything was already broken? Samantha's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, Mark saw something soft in her expression, something that made his heart ache. It's not about fixing things, Mark. It's about accepting what's happened and letting us go. You've held us captive with your expectations and your guilt. But we're done. We're done being your prisoners. Mark's voice cracked. I didn't know. I didn't know I was holding you back. I didn't know I was hurting you. Ella's face hardened. And that's the problem, Mark. You never bothered to learn. You never asked. You never saw us. You just saw what you wanted. The room fell into a heavy silence, and Mark felt the weight of their words settle into him, suffocating him with truth. He had thought he was doing what was right, but in reality, he had been living in a fantasy, one where his good intentions had justified his actions. But the truth wasn't about intentions, it was about impact. And the impact of his decisions had left deep scars on the people he claimed to care for. The man at the door spoke again, his voice soft, but filled with finality. You can't change the past, Mark. You can only change how you move forward. And that's your choice. You've made a mess of things, but you have one last chance to make things right. Mark turned to the man, his mind racing. How? How do I make it right? The man's expression softened, just slightly. By acknowledging the truth. By accepting that you can't control everything. And by giving these women the one thing they've always needed, their freedom. To choose their own path, to find their own way. Mark's heart thudded in his chest. He had been clinging to the illusion that he could fix everything, that he could control the outcome. But the only thing left to do was let go. To let them go. To let himself go. Lisa stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Mark. You can't save us, Mark. You never could. But you can give us the space to heal. To live our own lives. To finally be free. The words hit him like a wave, and he felt himself begin to crumble. He had spent so many years thinking he could be their savior. But all this time, they had only been trying to save themselves. I'm sorry, Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. I never should have. I never should have tried to control you. Lisa nodded slowly. It's too late for apologies, Mark. But it's not too late to let us go. Mark swallowed hard, the truth sinking deep into him. For the first time, he felt like he was truly seeing them, all of them. Not as victims, not as people he had saved, but as individuals who had fought for their own survival, their own freedom. The man stepped aside, opening the door wide. It's time, Mark. Let them go. Mark stood there for a moment, his body trembling, unsure of what to do next. But then, he did the only thing he could do. He stepped aside. The women moved toward the door, pausing only for a moment to look back at Mark. There was no anger in their eyes now, no bitterness. Just something that resembled peace. And then, without another word, they walked out of the room. And Mark, for the first time in 20 years, felt like he was standing alone. The door closed softly behind them, and for a long time, Mark didn't move. He just stood there, in the silence, letting the weight of everything fall over him. He had lost so much. But in losing it, he had gained something too. He had finally understood.